Hello and welcome to Jessie Bear Book Club. Today we are talking about Breaking Free, How I Escaped Polygamy, The FLDS Cult and My Father Warren Jeffs by Rachel Jeffs. I have wanted to read this book for ages and it was on my Amazon wish list for literally years. But I always put off reading it, one because it was very expensive to get it shipped from America, and two because I was a little bit worried about how graphic it might be when it comes to child abuse, and that is just, it gives me the shivers. The book isn't overly long. It is only 282 pages, which is quite short, and the chapters are only about 8 pages long, so you can fly through it. I finished it in under a week, and even though I was worried about it being very graphic, it really wasn't. I would say maybe the first 3 to 4 chapters cover that subject, and then it is only brought up about very briefly later on. The book is very factual throughout and covers Rachel's early childhood up until she leaves in her mid-30s. I did enjoy the book, but there is definitely a focus on the factual elements and not so much on feelings or thoughts. And I understand why Rachel did this. I mean, she's already putting her story out there and she doesn't want everyone knowing every single little intimate thought she's ever had. I feel like Rachel was protecting herself by only giving us what we actually needed to know and keeping one area of her life secret. I already knew a lot of the information in this book from reading The Witness Were Read and watching documentaries and TV shows, but it was interesting seeing Rachel's idea of her father, especially when he decides to become the prophet, because that is not something that was covered in The Witness Were Read because Rebecca Musser left then. So when Rachel sees her father acting as if he's having a revelation and shaking on the floor, the only thing she can think to herself is, God, he's a good actor, and how are these people falling for this? Because she never believed he was the prophet because of what he did to her when she was a child. Rachel's married life was interesting to read about, but I would have liked a bit more detail about the infighting that went on between her and her sister wives. You do get to see how vindictive the sister wives were to her children, but it's in the past tense, and I would have liked to have maybe got a few more personal details or a bit more information about Rachel confronting her sister wives. I know she didn't, and she very much kept sweet, as all polygamous wives are meant to do. I simply would have liked a little bit more fleshing out of her sister wives as individual characters, because you don't get to know them in this book. I know they were separated and there was a lot of backwards and forwards to houses of hiding, but I would have liked to have known a little bit about them, like Molly was nice, Sarah was horrible, Trish was lovely until she had to leave. That was all I really wanted, and I thought that got glossed over a bit, but she was probably protecting these women and their right to tell their own story if they ever decide to leave. The many houses of hiding where Rachel was made to live on her own, either in isolation with her sister wives, with her children, with her sisters, all sound horrible and soul-crushingly boring. That's the only way I can describe them, especially for children. I mean, that last house of hiding she was in when her son was just a little baby and they had no toys and he just used to sit outside and play in the sand, sprinkling it from one hand to the other, that made my heart hurt. I also thought it was incredibly interesting seeing how vindictive Warren got the longer he was in prison and the crazier his revelations became, and how people just followed them, not being able to eat sugar, not being able to eat sweets, not being allowed toys, or just the ridiculousness of the things he came out with, like rice is a sin, God hates ice cream. Who was coming up with this? And especially the no physical contact, especially when it became no physical contact between husbands and wives and mothers and children later on. Like, who? That's so cruel. It's a form of torture. I also liked getting Rachel's perspective on the raid of the ranch on Zion and how that really affected her family personally, and things that perhaps Rebecca Musser didn't think about when she was helping with the raid on Zion. I know it was a good thing and it had to happen because of the abuses that were going on there, but when she was talking about all the children getting sick once they were put into those holding pens because they were not used to processed food, and there was an outbreak of chickenpox that swept through them, you know, Child Protective Services taking away phones, which could be these people's only contact with the outside world. A lot of these children and teenagers were there without their parents because of Warren's decrees, so they were completely on their own. And I understand how hard it was for Child Protective Services, and I also understand how horrible and soul shattering it would be for the people who are having to deal with this on a daily basis and so unused to the outside world. I also really enjoyed seeing Rich's devotion to the church above everything else, including his own children, when their son Grulin falls out a 3-story window and breaks his pelvis, and Rich will not take him to hospital without the say-so of Warren. That is so horrible, and could you imagine watching your child in pain but not being allowed to take them to hospital like Rachel was because your husband and the child's grandfather, your father, says no? I mean, you'd be tearing your hair out in frustration because you're emotionally and mentally chained not to be able to help your little baby. I mean, ugh. Who could do that? Who is vindictive enough to put rules like that in place? Answer Warren Jeffs. I also really enjoyed seeing how the longer Warren was in prison, the more the power dynamic within the cult changed, and Warren's family, Rachel and her siblings, were no longer of the utmost importance. It was now her uncles Lyle and Seth, and their families were now of the utmost importance because they were pretty much the head of the church. They were the people conveying the messages from Warren, and they were taking advantage of it, just as Warren did after his father Roland had a stroke. And it was just repeating. This cycle of abuse was just repeating, and if Warren hadn't gone to prison, it would have continued, and it did continue. I mean, I believe now Rachel's uncles are in prison. One of the more painful moments I felt towards the end of the book was when Rachel's uncle says she has to get on food stamps, so she goes ahead and gets some food stamps, and then as soon as her food card arrives, he takes it off her and says that he will dole out her food. And she tells a story about how sometimes they only had a bag of rice to live on for an entire week, her and her 5 children. Nothing else, no oil, no salt, nothing, just rice. Could you imagine living on that diet and you're not allowed to go out? You've got nothing to do apart from pray and sew. One of the moments towards the end of the book, right before Rachel and some of her sisters decide to leave the cult, that I thought was of the utmost importance was when Rachel's sister Angela tells her that she was also abused by their father, and it creates this strong bond, this resilience, because up until this point, everyone, according to Rachel, in her mind, believed Warren was the prophet. Nobody was going against this, and it was just her in her own head going, I know he's not a good person, I know he's not a good person. So simply having one other person to say, I know he's not a good person as well, we both know, and that made all the difference towards both of them leaving. This book is not a complete downer though. Rachel finds joys in the little things when it rains and she's in that house of hiding and she takes her and her son outside and they walk around in their bare feet in the rain just to feel the wet sand between their toes. And when her and her sisters would climb onto the roof and eat ice cream when they were in a house of hiding together. Rachel really shows you in this book that you have to take joy in the little things because it's the little things that make up life. And that was one of the reasons I really liked this book. And I think we've all learnt so much about this in the last year due to COVID and not being able to go out. I also found it super interesting that even after Rachel and her sisters left the FLDS, they were still caught up in this polygamous world that exists in Utah, that her grandparents, her maternal grandparents, who they went to live with, their entire family were still polygamist, and people were looking at her and her sisters as prospective wives and asking to court them. And I thought, so you've left a cult and you're about to join another cult? I mean, would have been so easy for her to fall back into that, and I'm so glad she didn't. This story does have a happy ending with her meeting a man who had also left polygamy called Brandon, and we know they get married because you see that in the TV show Escaping Polygamy. And it's good to see that some of these stories do have happy endings, that it isn't all pain and suffering, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's a joyous story at the end because she's happy. And I found her on Instagram. She has a lovely Instagram. Her kids all look really happy. She changed her 2 oldest daughters' names, which I know is something a lot of polygamists do once they leave, because they're like, that's my old life with my old name and this is my new life with my new name. So that didn't freak me out or anything. I was almost expecting it. I also thought it was super romantic that when she's thinking about leaving after her 2 sisters have left, she goes over to their house and they watch Titanic, and I thought that was so cute. I mean, the first movie you've watched in probably about 25 years and you choose to watch Titanic, that's really cute. I liked it. This book also has some great colour photographs right in the middle, and I am a complete sucker, as you guys know, for photographs in biographies. I love them. I always flick right to the middle before I even start the book. So thumbs up for that. I give this book 7 out of 10. It could have been a little bit deeper, there could have been a little bit more intimate feeling, but I understand why Rachel took the decision not to include everything. And overall, I really enjoyed it. It has a happy ending. It'd be a really good holiday read because it's not very long and it's gripping. I mean, I read it in less than a week. I would recommend it, especially if you're interested in polygamist cults. I think this would be a good opener book. I've read a lot of other books, which reviews will be coming out soon. I'm working on them, editing them, but they're quite a bit longer than this book, so this one was just an off-the-cuff review. But definitely read it. It's a really good introduction to the world of polygamy. If you don't know anything from the outside, it does cover a bit of the history, so that's really good. And if you enjoyed this review, you can check out my other autobiography reviews. I have one on Unorthodox and Beyond Belief and The Witness Were Read. I also have one about Louis Theroux's book, How to Get Through This. And remember, if you like this video, hit the thumbs up and subscribe so you won't miss any of my other reviews, which will be coming out very soon. Until next time, guys, bye!